Under the coercion of his friend, a newly separated lonely man uses a dating app and gets matched with a seductive woman who happens to be in disguise. One morning, Chris, alongside his friend Eddie, converse through a video conferencing platform to improve his star-crossed dating profile. Eddie encourages him to publicize his profile, but Chris hesitates as he feels it's wrong. With a sigh, Eddie explains that Chris is separated from Sharon, so there's no issue if he pursues someone else. Chris worries for his son Mikey, as he might get distracted if he ever gets matched with an alluring woman. Eddie disregards his negative thoughts and encourages him to become more confident as they're only starting. For him, a confident man can snag a date, so Chris activates his profile's visibility. Pleased with his decision, Eddie orders him to swipe right to every woman he sees to expand his options. A few swipes later, Chris accidentally matches with their acquaintance, Caroline, dreading that she might snitch on Sharon. Eddie remains calm and tells him to unmatch her. After unmatching her, Caroline messages him on Linkverse, and she sends him a screenshot of his dating profile to confirm if it's him. Now panicking, Chris fears that his presence on the dating app will disappoint Sharon, but Eddie insists there's nothing to worry about as they're separated. Chris reminds him that they're only separated for 2 weeks, but Eddie remains firm in his opinion. Due to his unhelpful advice, Chris ends their call and responds to Caroline to try to deny his presence in the dating app. Suddenly, he receives a phone call from Sharon, so he informs Eddie about it. His friend urges him to ignore her, but Chris refuses to comply and answers Sharon's call. When Sharon appears, the woman inquires about the credentials she needs to access their baby monitor, so Chris reminds her of the link he sent to her. In the middle of their conversation, Charlize, Eddie's ex-wife, appears and checks on the pair as she wants Sharon to enjoy her singlehood at their friend's bachelorette party. Sharon gives her a pointed look, so Charlize tells her that she's just looking out for her. Moments later, Chris resumes chatting with Caroline, and he pleads to her to keep it a secret. Though she's unimpressed with his decision, Caroline agrees in the end, so Chris decides to delete his profile before things escalate. However, when Chris is about to delete his account, his attention falls on a seductive woman named Adra. Without hesitation, Chris swipes right at her, and they match instantly. He notices a link attached to her profile, so his curious mind compels him to click on it, but it's inaccessible. Chris remembers that he's a father, so he tries to unmatch her for it might be a deal breaker for her. But before he can proceed, Adra initiates their first interaction, leading him to respond to her. During their conversation, Chris learns that Adra was hurt ages ago, so reading's the only leisure activity she enjoys. Moreover, she can't leave her place because she's trapped in her body, intriguing Chris. Out of nowhere, she asks for his help, and Chris wonders how. Adra invites him to have a video call, but Chris thinks it's a scam, so he consults Eddie about it. Though Eddie cautions him not to click Adra's link, he asks his friend if she is attractive, which Chris interprets as approval. Ready to risk it, Chris tidies himself, removes his wedding ring, and hides Mikey's stroller from the background. Upon starting their call, Chris is confused as to why Adra can't talk, so she tells him she's lost her voice. The filter that obstructs her face bothers Chris, so he urges her to remove it, but Adra expresses that she wants to be comfortable first. This time, Chris becomes suspicious of her, so he asks if she's a bot, but she laughs in response. Adra wants to prove that she's real, so she urges him to tell her what to do. Chris orders her to execute a Vulcan salute, and the woman complies. Then, Chris wishes to see her tattoos, so Adra gives him a brief yet seductive presentation of her inked body. Chris keeps his cool as he still believes that she might be performing the whole charade to scam him. However, he clarifies that he's broke, but Adra tells him that she's unbothered by his financial status. Now, Chris reveals that he's still married and a father, which becomes his fuel to criticize himself for talking to her instead of tending to his child. Surprisingly, Adra doesn't think badly of him and validates his struggles. Slowly, their conversation takes an intimate route as Adra invites him to come over. Chris wonders where, so she sends him her location. Before he gives his answer, Chris contacts Eddie to express his fear of visiting Adra as he might be killed, but his friend believes getting blackmailed has a higher probability. Curious about her, Eddie requests to see Adra's profile, and he's surprised because he matched with her yesterday. When Eddie ends their call, Chris messages Adra that he can't visit her, but a sudden electric surge and a gust of wind take his attention away from their conversation. Chris checks on his framed wedding photo with Sharon, and he becomes worried about seeing the glass shattered. That night, Chris goes to Mikey's room to check on his son, unaware that someone's accessing his star-crossed account. To update his Instagram account, Chris takes Mikey's photographs and uploads them. As he scrolls down to his feed, he sees that Charlize has posted a picture with Sharon at the party, so he decides to stalk her story to find more. Suddenly, Chris receives a notification that Adra tagged him in her story, leading him to check on them. His distress heightens because he discovers that Adra has also left provocative comments on his uploaded photo, so he messaged her to remove them. While he's dealing with her, Dr. Orion Zephyr sends him a message, but Chris is unaware of it because his attention is zeroed on Adra. Since Adra refuses to cooperate, Chris deletes the uploaded photo, but she keeps on tagging him on her story to get his attention. Unable to resist anymore, he checks on her, but his moment's interrupted when his mother, Denise, calls him. Out of frustration, Denise reprimands him for his actions, especially since they were streamed on the nanny cam. Following Denise's confrontation, Sharon calls him, and the woman's disappointed in him for watching sensitive materials in their son's room. In his defense, he's only watching on Instagram, which Sharon speculates that he's desiring after Charlize. Chris denies her allegations, but Sharon begins to show her insecurity and reminds him of his shortcomings in their relationship. Now, she thinks that it's a mistake to try and make things work with him, which infuriates Chris because he thinks she's being unfair. Not long after, Chris calls Sharon and takes accountability for his mistakes, especially in their relationship. He admits that he was overwhelmed when Sharon became pregnant with their child, as he's still unprepared to handle such a new chapter in their lives. Upon hearing this, Sharon wants to know if Chris still finds her attractive, and the man confirms. Delighted by his words, Sharon video calls him to show her current appearance, but Chris is concerned at the unusual lines on her face. Thinking it's just a filter, Chris encourages her to turn it off, but Sharon takes offense to his words, so she abruptly ends the call. As if on cue, Adra messages him, and he's surprised to discover that she sent him a provocative video. Chris watches it, but he's unsatisfied because Adra's covering her face. He pleads with her to show her face, but Adra profusely refuses. He asks for the reason, so she reveals that she got hurt badly, making him want to know who caused her injuries. Suddenly, Chris receives a message from Zephyr, and he's confused as to why the astrophysicist knows he's talking with a woman. However, Chris has yet to respond because Adra wants to invite him over to her house. Zephyr's messages are interesting, so Chris turns down Adra's invitation to focus on them. Curious about the astrophysicist, Chris stalks Zephyr's social media account and learns that he specializes in particle physics and dark matter phenomenology. Chris receives a sudden video call invitation from Zephyr, but he declines it, so the astrophysicist sends him a voice message, begging him to spare him some of his time. In the end, Chris answers his video call invitation, and Zephyr warns him about how dangerous the woman he's talking with is. Therefore, he instructs Chris to cease his interaction with her and wait for him to arrive at his residence. Chris finds his actions weird, especially since he tracked him using his phone. Due to his strange behavior, Chris searches Zephyr online, and he becomes more suspicious of him since the astrophysicist was fired after a misconduct on one of his female students. Chris believes the said student is Adra, so he confronts Zephyr about it, but the astrophysicist clarifies that she isn't his student. Regardless, Chris still finds him suspicious, so he ends their conversation and blocks his account. After this, Chris video calls Adra and informs her about his interaction with Zephyr, which causes her to become fearful. Adra wants him to come over, but he reminds her that he has yet to agree. However, Adra tells him that he confirmed it on the dating app, but Chris has no recollection of it. Chris checks his email, and he becomes alarmed that someone's accessed his account. This leads him to assume that Zephyr's the culprit for it, so Adra becomes afraid for her life since she gave him her address, thinking he's Chris. Immediately, Chris calls the police, but he's frustrated that no one's answering. Without a choice, he checks on Zephyr's chat on a video conferencing platform and is surprised to see a video about an entity attempting to enter the physical realm. Shortly after, Chris receives a phone call from Eddie, and he learns that his friend was the one who hacked into his account, leaving him in disbelief. Eddie explains that he wants to meet up with Adra since Chris intends to deal with his marital issues. His actions infuriate Chris, especially since he broke a principle in their friendship. In Eddie's defense, Adra's vulnerability is attractive to him, and it makes him want to console her. Now, the pair enter a heated argument, and Chris is afraid that using his identity might be a crime. Eddie still believes there's nothing wrong with it, so Chris ends their conversation as he's becoming more unreasonable. Chris returns his attention to his laptop and proceeds to watch the video from Zephyr. There, he witnesses a goat birthing its offspring, which resembles a demon, intriguing him. Deeper into the video, the goat herder proceeds to kill the entity, and Chris becomes unsettled. Following this, a distressed Adra video calls Chris, and the woman updates him about a car that drives by. To calm her, Chris explains that it's not Zephyr's car and that the one she sent her address to is Eddie. With this settled, Adra invites Chris to come over as she begins to be in the mood. Chris refuses as the recent events weird him out, but Adra promises to make him feel better, so he eventually gives in. Before starting their virtual intimacy, Adra orders him to light a candle, and he complies without question. Then, Adra lies on her bed, motivating Chris to immerse himself in her temptation. Strangely enough, Chris gets transported into Adra's room, but he's unbothered for he thinks it's part of his imagination. Once the deed is finished, Chris awakens alone in the darkened room, and he panics as he can't find Adra. He decides to find an exit, but his fear further heightens when the door and window lead to nowhere. Chris starts to lose hope, but a sudden buzzing of his phone on the bed catches his attention. On the other line, Zephyr knows that Chris is trapped and explains that Adra manipulated him. Chris asks what's happening, but the astrophysicist asks for confirmation if they're communicating using his phone. Zephyr senses Chris's annoyance, so he ensures that it's proof that the supernatural occurrence is indeed occurring. Moving forward, Zephyr wonders if he engaged in a physical and intimate act with Adra, but Chris denies it and clarifies that it was virtual. Zephyr asks if he took substances before engaging with Adra, but Chris becomes further confused. The astrophysicist explains that Adra entrances her prey while they're in a receptive state, but his persistent inquisition only irritates Chris. Upon hearing his anger, Zephyr encourages him to follow what he has to say because he believes that he can still return to the physical realm since he didn't become intimate with Adra physically. He orders Chris to focus on the wall where the door in Adra's room is, so the man complies. When Chris cries out of helplessness, Zephyr assures him his physical body is still in the house, but he must find his way back. To do this, he helps Chris visualize that he is in his home, staring at his laptop screen. Chris complies, and he's startled at being able to get a glimpse of the physical realm. Later on, Chris realizes that he's indeed trapped in Adra's manipulation, but he still has a hard time focusing. Therefore, Zephyr instructs him to close his eyes and think that he's back home. Chris sees a memory of Sharon and Mikey, which opens a small hole that leads back to his reality. At that moment, Chris sees a message from Eddie, who informs him that he is currently in front of Adra's home. He reveals that Adra invited him to come over to help her deal with Zephyr. Suddenly, Eddie calls him, motivating Chris to rip the wall that separates him from the physical world, but he's still far from reaching his body. Chris tries to warn Eddie about how dangerous Adra is, but his words don't reach him. Without a choice, Chris listens as Eddie confides in him about embracing his impotence through Adra's promised intimacy. Shortly after, Eddie enters a room and sees a demonic figure perched by the bed, but he's unfazed by the sight. Adra greets him and compliments his attractiveness, pleasing him. Then, Adra orders him to approach her, and upon his compliance, she disrobes him. The succubus manipulates him by delving into his insecurities, especially his feeling of being underappreciated. Since she earned his affection, she invites him to see her body, but she cautions him of its unsightly appearance. Regardless, Eddie begs to see it, so Adra allows him to unveil her body. Eddie sees a lump of flesh underneath the blanket, but he deems it beautiful. Pleased with his reaction, Adra initiates making love with him. Unfortunately, Adra finds his seed lacking, so she kills him. Chris cries in agony as he witnesses his friend's demise, but he's alarmed when he notices that Adra's rejuvenating herself with Eddie's blood. The succubus starts to approach him, so Chris tries to return to his body. As expected, Chris falls further into the abyss as he fails to reach the other end. Back in Chris's residence, Zephyr arrives, but he's disappointed to discover that the man has yet to return to his body. The astrophysicist apologizes to Chris because he's gonna kill him, for he's beyond hope. Zephyr puts the gun on Chris's hand to frame it like he ended his own life. Right then, Sharon returns home, so Zephyr hides from her. Sharon wants to discuss their relationship, but she's starting to worry that Chris is unresponsive. For this reason, Sharon contacts the emergency room, but she sees that there's another presence in their house, leading her to report a burglar. Immediately, Zephyr attacks her, but Sharon tries to resist, so the astrophysicist threatens to shoot her. He orders her to cancel the emergency assistance and lies that it's just a misunderstanding. Though Sharon complies, she regrets to inform him that the authorities are on their way. Left without a choice, Zephyr decides to frame it as a domestic tragedy. Before things escalate, Adra appears on Chris's laptop and tries to seduce Zephyr. The man refuses to fall to her charms, so he closes the gadget. When Zephyr resumes his plan of killing Sharon, Chris pleads with Adra to help his wife. Briefly, Chris is able to return to his body, giving Sharon an opportunity to disarm Zephyr. Afterward, Adra pushes the gun to Sharon's location, and the woman uses it to threaten the astrophysicist. To explain his motive, Zephyr warns Sharon that Adra is now residing in her husband's body. He adds that she'll use Chris to impregnate her so she can infiltrate the physical world and become stronger. The woman remains untrusting of him, causing her to fire the gun. Now fatally wounded, Zephyr proceeds to leave as he has an important matter to do before he passes away. In his car, Zephyr records a farewell video to his daughter Jean, in which he apologizes for involving her in his controversial situation. Then, he instructs her to publish all of the research he's conducted online so that people can easily access it. Meanwhile, Sharon professes her love for Chris, and upon kissing him, he returns to his body. The next day, Sharon coordinates with the authorities whereas Chris undergoes a physical assessment. Moments later, Chris, alongside Sharon and Mikey, spends the day together to make up for the days they're apart. Afterward, Chris heads to the kitchen to prepare Mikey's milk, but when Caroline messages him, he's confused. The woman sends him multiple seductive photographs, but Chris refuses to interact with her as he loves his wife. Though disappointed, Caroline orders him to delete the photos, and the man complies. However, in the middle of it, Chris is intrigued that one of the photos is actually a video. Curious, Chris plays it, but the video continues to buffer. All of a sudden, the video shows footage of him in real time, and Adra hugs him from behind. Following Chris's absence, Sharon starts to worry, so she searches for him and he appears behind her. Chris initiates making love with her and Sharon surrenders to him. Unbeknownst to her, Chris is trapped in Adra's world, and she's controlling his physical body to impregnate Sharon. Through the possible offspring, Adra shares that it'll ensure her survivability and strengthen her power. Opposed to her plans, Chris resists against Adra, which gives him control over his body. To prevent Adra from using him, Chris grabs a glass shard from their broken picture frame and stabs his crotch. Sharon screams in horror, but Chris is relieved that the source of their possible demise is now gone. At that moment, Zephyr appears, and he subdues Chris with an axe. Following these events, Denise visits Chris to check on his son, who's now in a vegetative state. Then, she listens as Sharon informs her that the doctors are able to extract some of Chris's DNA, so she reveals that she used them to produce a sibling for Mikey. Happily, Sharon shows her a photo over ultrasound, making Denise feel fortunate. After her, Charlize shares that she also used Chris's DNA to conceive a child she longs for. Denise cries tears of joy, for she believes they're a blessing to their family. On the other hand, Chris can only cry in defeat because the unborn children are far from being blessings.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.